Chapter 1. The Falling Light. The evening sky over Maplewood shimmered with an eerie brilliance, a quiet prelude to the coming snowstorm. It was the kind of night that felt impossibly vast, with stars glinting like shards of ice against an indigo canvas. For Charlotte Greer, however, the beauty above was merely a backdrop to her increasingly tangled life. She leaned against the frostbitten railing of her grandmother's old farmhouse, her breath curling in delicate spirals in the cold air. The house's creaking timbers and sagging roof lines felt as fragile as the memories they sheltered. A place she had avoided for years and yet couldn't seem to leave now. Charlotte hadn't planned to return to Maplewood, much less in December. But her grandmother's passing had left her with a house full of belongings to sort through and an ache in her chest she couldn't quite name. The townsfolk had welcomed her back with cautious smiles, their warmth tempered by the long shadow of her absence. Yet tonight, the solitude was hers alone, and it was both a balm and a weight. The sky's brightness grew unnaturally intense, snapping Charlotte out of her thoughts. She frowned, tilting her head to study the heavens. A streak of light burst across the darkness, blazing white-hot as it tore through the firmament. For a moment, the earth seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a soundless shudder, the light plunged beyond the tree-line at the far edge of the property, leaving a trail of molten gold in its wake. Charlotte's heart thudded in her chest. A meteor, she thought, but there had been something strange about it. A subtle hum in the air, a vibration that lingered even after the light vanished. Curiosity bloomed, as undeniable as the pull of gravity. Charlotte grabbed her coat and boots from the mudroom, her steps brisk despite the icy ground. The field beyond the house stretched wide and barren, the snow crisp and unbroken save for her hurried footprints. She paused at the edge of the woods, where the shadows of towering pines loomed like sentinels. The darkness here was thicker, the air tinged with the resinous scent of evergreen and something else, a faint metallic tang she couldn't place. She pressed forward, the trees swallowing her in a cocoon of whispers and sighs. Somewhere ahead, an owl hooted, its call sharp and mournful. Charlotte tightened her scarf, her breath coming in quick puffs as the cold seeped through her layers. The woods had always unnerved her as a child, their depths hiding stories she was too afraid to imagine. Tonight, though, something drew her onward, a strange pull that felt almost magnetic. The clearing appeared suddenly, a small break in the forest's grip. In its center lay a shallow crater, its edges still steaming faintly in the frosty air. Charlotte's eyes widened as she stepped closer. At the crater's heart rested a dark, irregular stone, faintly glowing as though embers smoldered just beneath its surface. It was larger than she expected, roughly the size of a basketball, its surface pocked and veined with streaks of silver. She crouched down, the heat emanating from the stone prickling her skin even through her gloves. A sense of awe and trepidation warred within her. What was this thing? And why did it feel so alive? The faint hum from earlier returned, vibrating softly in her chest, as though the object were speaking in a language she couldn't quite hear. Charlotte reached out tentatively, her gloved fingers brushing the stone's surface. Heat surged through her hand, startling her, but it wasn't painful. Instead, it was invigorating, like stepping into a sunbeam on a cold day. She pulled back, staring at the stone as a strange thought surfaced unbidden. This wasn't meant to land here. A rustle of movement behind her snapped her head around. The forest was still, but Charlotte's heart raced. She scanned the shadows, her pulse quickening. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling slightly. The woods swallowed the sound. She stood, the warmth of the meteor forgotten as a chill ran down her spine. Logic told her it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe, startled by her presence. But something about the silence that followed felt unnatural, weighted. Her feet moved instinctively, backing toward the edge of the clearing. Yet even as she retreated, a part of her felt reluctant to leave the stone behind. When she reached the safety of the farmhouse, she bolted the door and sank into the worn armchair by the fire, her mind racing. The night stretched long and restless, her thoughts spinning with questions she couldn't yet answer. What had she found in the woods? And why did it feel as though it had found her instead? Above the farmhouse, the stars burned brighter than ever, their cold light spilling over Maplewood like a silent promise. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Woods. Morning arrived in Maplewood with a muted stillness, the kind that came only after a fresh snowfall. The world outside Charlotte's window was blanketed in white, the snowflakes clinging to tree branches like delicate lace. The sky, pale and heavy, seemed to promise more to come. She had slept little, her mind replaying the events of the night before. The stone in the clearing, the faint hum she could still almost feel. It all lingered at the edges of her thoughts like a half-remembered dream. Charlotte wrapped herself in a thick woolen sweater and made her way to the kitchen, where the remnants of her grandmother's life seemed frozen in time. The chipped porcelain teapot sat on the counter, the same one her grandmother had used every morning, its cheerful floral pattern faded with age. Charlotte filled it with water and set it on the stove, her movements automatic. The house felt eerily quiet, as though it too were waiting for something. As the kettle whistled, Charlotte's eyes drifted to the window. The woods loomed in the distance, their dark silhouettes stark against the snow. The clearing where she had found the meteorite was out there, hidden among the trees, and the thought of it pulled at her with an almost magnetic force. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something extraordinary, something that defied explanation. By the time she stepped outside, the sun was barely visible, a pale orb behind a veil of clouds. The air was sharp and bracing, her breath forming clouds that dissipated almost as quickly as they appeared. She had bundled up in her thickest coat, her scarf wound tightly around her neck, but the cold still seeped into her bones. Carrying a small satchel with a notebook, flashlight, and gloves, Charlotte trudged through the snow toward the woods. The path was familiar but changed by the snowfall. The familiar landmarks softened and obscured. The deeper she ventured, the quieter the world became, until all she could hear was the crunch of her boots and the occasional whisper of wind through the branches. It was a silence that felt alive, as though the woods were holding their breath. When she reached the clearing, Charlotte stopped, her gaze drawn to the crater at its center. The stone was still there, its surface duller in the daylight, but no less imposing. The faint hum she had felt the night before was absent, replaced by a heavy stillness that made the air feel thick. She approached cautiously, her boots sinking into the snow. Kneeling beside the meteorite, Charlotte reached into her satchel and pulled out her notebook. She sketched the stone, her pencil moving quickly over the page, capturing its jagged contours and metallic veins. As she worked, she couldn't shake the sensation that she was being watched. Her eyes darted to the tree line, but the woods were empty, their shadows unmoving. Her pencil stilled as she noticed something she hadn't seen the night before. Embedded within the stone's surface was a faintly glowing pattern, a series of lines and shapes that seemed almost purposeful. She leaned closer, her breath misting the air. The shapes resembled constellations, their arrangement too precise to be random. A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She touched the stone again, this time pressing her fingers against one of the glowing lines. The warmth she had felt the night before returned, spreading through her hand and up her arm. But this time, there was something more. A flicker of light danced across the stone surface, and a low vibration hummed beneath her fingers. It was faint, but it felt alive, like a heartbeat. Startled, Charlotte pulled back, her pulse quickening. What was this thing? And why did it feel so aware? She glanced at her notebook, her sketches now seeming inadequate to capture what she had just experienced. The thought of telling someone, anyone, crossed her mind, but who would believe her? This was the kind of story that belonged in science fiction, not her quiet corner of the world. A sudden snap of a branch shattered the silence, and Charlotte's head whipped around. The sound had come from the edge of the clearing. Her eyes scanned the trees, her heart hammering. She saw nothing, but the sensation of being watched returned, stronger than before. The woods felt different now, as though they were holding a secret too big to contain. Charlotte's instinct screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity rooted her in place. Slowly, she stood, clutching her notebook to her chest. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice wavering. The clearing swallowed her words, offering no response. The light in the sky dimmed as the clouds thickened, and the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, otherworldly whistle. Charlotte's grip on her notebook tightened. She cast one last glance at the meteorite before retreating, her steps quick and deliberate. The woods seemed to close in around her as she hurried back toward the farmhouse, the weight of the stone's presence heavy in her mind. When she reached the house, she bolted the door behind her and leaned against it, her chest heaving. The warmth of the fire in the hearth did little to chase away the chill that had settled over her. She opened her notebook, staring at the sketches she had made. The constellations, the glow, the strange hum. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she didn't yet understand. As the snow began to fall again, Charlotte sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the woods. The clearing and its secret called to her still, but the echo of whatever had been watching her lingered. She knew she couldn't stay away for long. The stone had found her, and she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't finished with her yet. Chapter 3. The Trail of Stardust. Amelia walked down Main Street, her coat wrapped tightly around her as she tried to push away the lingering thoughts from the conversation with Ian. Christmas lights twinkled above her, casting a soft glow that illuminated the street with a warmth that didn't quite match her inner turmoil. The snow had started to fall again, light flakes drifting through the night air, and the town seemed to have come alive with the holiday spirit. But despite the festive cheer surrounding her, Amelia couldn't help but feel like she was standing at the edge of something important, something life-changing. She had never expected to find herself back in Willowbrook, and certainly not like this. After years of running from the past, she had returned to the town where everything had begun. And now, in the midst of the holiday season, she was confronted with a version of her old self that felt both foreign and familiar. Ian had been a part of that past, and yet now, standing at the heart of everything that had once felt so simple and innocent, it was impossible to deny the pull between them. She paused in front of a storefront, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at the Christmas tree in the window, adorned with delicate ornaments and sparkling lights. There was something so timeless about the scene, something that reminded her of the joy and hope she used to associate with this time of year. She had spent so many Christmases in the hustle and bustle of city life, focusing on work and responsibilities, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to experience the season in its purest form. Lost in thought, Amelia jumped slightly, turning to see Ian standing beside her, his warm smile softening the chill of the evening. His hands were buried deep in the pockets of his coat, his posture casual, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her heart flutter. "I didn't hear you," she said, a little flustered, though she quickly masked it with a smile. Ian chuckled. "You seem deep in thought. Just thought I'd check in. How are you holding up?" Amelia shrugged, though the gesture felt more like an attempt to shrug off the emotions she wasn't quite ready to confront. "It's just a lot to take in, you know? Being back here, seeing everything. I thought I had left it all behind. And yet, here you are, Ian said with a knowing smile, his tone light but with a hint of understanding. Amelia couldn't help but meet his gaze, her eyes searching his face for the answers she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. I guess I am, but I never expected. I never thought I'd feel so conflicted about it. There was a brief silence, the sounds of the town's festivities fading into the background as Ian took a step closer. It's okay to feel that way. Coming back here isn't just about the town. It's about you too. It's about figuring out what's next, what you want. It's about being honest with yourself. Amelia swallowed, unsure of how to respond, but his words hit deeper than she expected. I don't know what I want anymore, Ian. Everything feels so uncertain. I came back thinking it was just about the cabin, but it's more than that now. I don't know what I'm doing. You don't have to have it all figured out, Ian said gently, his voice reassuring. Sometimes it's just about being present in the moment, letting life unfold. You've already taken the first step by coming back, and now maybe it's time to let yourself just be. Amelia looked up at him, meeting his eyes. For the first time since her return to Willowbrook, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Maybe it wasn't so much about the answers or the certainty. Maybe it was about embracing the unknown and trusting that the pieces would fall into place. I don't know if I'm ready for all of that yet, she admitted, her voice soft. But there was a lightness to it now, a sense of possibility. But I want to try. For once, I just want to see where things go. Ian's smile deepened, his eyes warm with something that looked almost like relief. That's all any of us can do, he said, his tone filled with quiet assurance. Take it one step at a time. As the evening wore on and they walked through the town, the magic of the Christmas lights seemed to wrap around them, illuminating the path ahead. Amelia felt a shift inside her, a sense of peace settling in that she hadn't expected. Maybe it wasn't about knowing the future, about having everything planned out. Maybe it was about allowing herself the freedom to experience the present, to let life unfold naturally, and to trust that the journey itself would lead her exactly where she needed to be. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't seem like such a scary thought. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Constellation. The night enveloped Maplewood in a velvety darkness, the kind that seemed to absorb sound and light alike. Charlotte sat by the window, her notebook spread open on the table before her, its pages filled with frantic sketches and half-formed theories. The fragment lay beside it, its faint hum now a constant presence, like a second heartbeat. Despite her exhaustion, sleep felt impossible. Questions churned in her mind, each one leading to another, like a labyrinth with no exit. The stars outside glittered like shards of ice, their cold light illuminating the snow-covered fields. Charlotte found herself staring at them, tracing constellations she barely remembered from her childhood. The fragment's markings had mirrored some of these patterns, their glowing lines impossibly precise. She couldn't shake the feeling that the stars were watching her, their silent gaze heavy with expectation. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window pane, and Charlotte startled, her hand knocking the fragment onto the floor. It landed with a soft thud, its hum momentarily silenced. She knelt to pick it up, the smooth metal cool against her fingers. As she stood, a faint glow flickered across its surface, pulsing in rhythm with her own breathing. She placed it back on the table, her heart pounding. Unable to bear the stillness of the house, Charlotte grabbed her coat and flashlight. The fragment's hum grew fainter as she stepped outside, as though it disapproved of being left behind. The air was biting, the cold sinking deep into her bones, but the clarity of the night sky was worth it. The stars seemed closer now, their light brighter and more insistent. Charlotte's feet carried her toward the woods almost without thought, her flashlight cutting a narrow path through the shadows. The trail she had followed earlier was gone, buried under fresh snow, but she knew the way by instinct. Her steps quickened as she neared the clearing, the memory of the markings and the fragments glow pulling at her like an invisible thread. When she reached the clearing, she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The crater and its surroundings had changed. The markings she had sketched were gone, their intricate patterns replaced by new ones, etched deeper into the snow. They formed concentric circles that radiated outward, their glowing lines more vivid than before. At the center of the formation was a faint light, hovering just above the ground. Charlotte's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness save for the eerie glow of the markings. Her pulse quickened as she stepped closer, the air around her tingling with static. The light at the center of the formation pulsed faintly, casting shifting shadows across the snow. It seemed to respond to her presence, its glow intensifying as she approached. The hum returned, louder now, filling the clearing with a low vibration that resonated in her chest. Charlotte knelt at the edge of the markings, her fingers trembling as she reached toward the light. It felt warm, almost alive, and as her hand brushed its surface, a surge of energy shot through her, leaving her gasping. Images flooded her mind, flashes of distant galaxies, swirling nebulae, and a vast, infinite darkness filled with pinpricks of light. She saw constellations she didn't recognize, their patterns etched into the fabric of space itself. And then, a voice, soft and melodic, whispered words she couldn't understand but felt deep in her soul. It was as though the universe itself was speaking to her. When the vision faded, Charlotte found herself lying in the snow, her flashlight discarded beside her. The glow at the center of the formation had dimmed, its energy seemingly spent. She sat up slowly, her head spinning. The markings around her had faded as well, their lines now faint impressions in the snow. She stumbled to her feet, her legs unsteady as she made her way back to the farmhouse. The fragment's hum grew louder as she approached, as though it sensed her return. Inside, she collapsed onto the chair by the table, her hands shaking as she reached for her notebook. Her pencil flew across the page, capturing the new markings and the faint light she had seen. But no sketch could capture the magnitude of what she had experienced. The vision, the voice, the overwhelming sense of connection. It was too vast, too incomprehensible to put into words. Yet she knew one thing for certain. The fragment and the meteorite were not random occurrences. They were part of something much larger, something that had chosen her for reasons she couldn't yet understand. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Charlotte's gaze drifted to the fragment. Its glow was faint now, but its presence filled the room, a silent reminder of the trail she had begun to follow. The stars outside seemed closer than ever, their light spilling into the farmhouse like a promise. Whatever lay ahead, Charlotte knew she couldn't face it alone. But for now, the watchful sky would be her guide, its silent gaze a beacon in the darkness. Chapter 5. The Frozen Secret. Charlotte awoke to a faint vibration reverberating through the floorboards of the farmhouse. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable, like the distant echo of a thunderstorm rumbling through the earth. For a moment, she lay still, her heart pounding as she tried to discern whether it was real or the lingering remnants of her vivid dreams. The fragment on the table glowed faintly in the dim morning light, its hum blending seamlessly with the vibrations. She pushed herself out of bed, the chill of the morning air biting at her skin. Wrapping herself in a thick blanket, Charlotte padded to the table, where the fragment sat like an unspoken promise. Its glow was steadier now, a soft, rhythmic pulse that seemed to match the beating of her heart. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above its surface, and for a moment, she hesitated. The memory of the vision from the night before still lingered, its intensity both thrilling and terrifying. Unable to shake the pull of curiosity, Charlotte gently lifted the fragment. The hum grew stronger, vibrating through her fingertips and sending a shiver up her spine. It felt alive, a piece of the universe distilled into something tangible. As she turned it over in her hands, faint lines of light traced across its surface, forming patterns that seemed almost purposeful. After a quick breakfast, Charlotte bundled up and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the snow crunching beneath her boots as she made her way to the woods. The sky above was a brilliant blue, the sunlight glinting off the snow-covered branches. Despite the brightness of the day, a sense of unease hung in the air, a whisper of something unseen. The path to the clearing felt shorter this time, as though the forest itself had shifted to guide her. When she arrived, the scene before her was both familiar and changed. The crater remained, its edges softened by the fresh snowfall, but the markings from the night before had vanished. In their place, faint trails of light wove through the snow, forming a labyrinthine pattern that seemed to stretch endlessly into the woods. Charlotte's breath caught as she knelt to inspect the trails. They glowed faintly, a shimmering silver that seemed to dance just beneath the surface of the snow. She reached out to touch one, and the light flared briefly before fading. The hum of the fragment in her pocket grew louder, as if urging her to follow the trails. Her boots crunched softly as she stepped onto the path, the glowing lines guiding her deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser here, their skeletal branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into fragmented beams. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle. The trail led her to a new clearing, smaller and more secluded than the first. At its center stood an ancient tree, its gnarled trunk wrapped in ivy and its branches reaching skyward like supplicant arms. The ground around it was bare, the snow melted away to reveal a circle of blackened earth. In the center of the circle lay another fragment, larger than the one she carried, its glow a deep, pulsating blue. Charlotte's pulse quickened as she approached the tree. The fragment seemed to call to her, its hum resonating in her chest. She knelt beside it, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch its surface. The moment her fingers made contact, a surge of light engulfed her, and the world around her dissolved into a kaleidoscope of stars and colors. She was no longer in the forest. Instead, she stood on a vast, endless plain of shimmering light, the ground beneath her feet reflecting the constellations above. The sky was alive with movement, stars shifting and forming patterns that seemed to tell a story she couldn't quite understand. In the distance, a figure emerged, its form indistinct but radiating a warm, golden light. "Who are you?" Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum that filled the air. The figure didn't speak, but she felt its presence, a comforting yet commanding force that seemed to envelop her. Images flooded her mind. The meteorite crashing to Earth, the glowing fragments scattered across the snow, and the intricate patterns etched into the forest floor. The vision shifted, and Charlotte saw herself standing at the edge of a great abyss, the fragment in her hand glowing brighter than ever. Beyond the abyss, a light burned fiercely, its intensity both blinding and magnetic. She felt the pull of it, a force that seemed to reach into the very core of her being. When the vision faded, Charlotte found herself back in the clearing, the fragment still glowing faintly in her hand. The larger fragment lay before her, its blue light now soft and steady. She took a deep, shaky breath, her mind racing to process what she had seen. The figure, the abyss, the light. It all felt connected, part of a puzzle she was only beginning to piece together. As she stood, the hum of the fragment in her pocket seemed to harmonize with the larger one, their vibrations blending into a single, resonant tone. The sound was comforting, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this journey. The universe, it seemed, had plans for her. Charlotte carefully placed the larger fragment into her satchel, its weight reassuring against her side. As she made her way back through the forest, the glowing trails began to fade, their light dimming until they were nothing more than faint impressions in the snow. The air felt lighter now, the oppressive energy lifting as she stepped into the open field. Back at the farmhouse, Charlotte set the fragments side by side on the table. Their hums were soft now, like the fading notes of a song. She lit a fire in the hearth and sat down with her notebook, her pencil flying across the pages as she documented everything she had seen and felt. The night stretched on, the stars outside watching over her as she worked. For the first time since the meteorite had arrived, Charlotte felt a sense of purpose, a quiet determination to uncover the truth. The whispers of light that had guided her this far were only the beginning, and she was ready to follow them wherever they might lead. Chapter 6. Under a Silent Sky. The morning air was crisp, biting even, as Amelia stepped out onto the front porch of the cafe. A layer of frost covered the wooden steps, glittering in the pale light of the early winter sun. The town, still wrapped in the quiet of the season, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the world to wake up. The holiday decorations were in full bloom now, garlands of evergreens strung across the streetlights, wreaths on every door, and tiny lights twinkling from every corner. The whole place had transformed, as if the calendar had flipped and the magic of Christmas had begun to seep into every inch of the town. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and took a deep breath, feeling the chill of the air fill her lungs. It was the kind of morning that made her think of hot cocoa, of being surrounded by family, of the warmth of a fire crackling in the hearth. But that was not her reality, not anymore, not here. She was alone, as she had been for so long, and yet there was a strange sense of comfort in that solitude. The chime of the doorbell behind her interrupted her thoughts, and Amelia turned to see Ian standing in the doorway of the cafe, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. He looked different today, softer, somehow, with a quiet energy that drew her in despite herself. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, it felt like time had slowed down, as though the bustling world outside had paused just for them. "Morning," Ian said, his voice warm against the cold morning air. He stepped out onto the porch, moving closer to where she stood. "Morning," she replied, her smile just a little too practiced. It had become a reflex now, something she did without thinking. There was a pause, a beat of silence between them, before Ian spoke again. "So, tonight's the night," he said, his tone carrying an undercurrent of anticipation. Amelia raised an eyebrow, not sure if she was following. "The tree lighting," Ian continued, his lips curving into a smile. "I'll be there, helping with the setup. Thought you might want to join me afterward. Maybe for a walk?" Amelia felt the flutter of nerves in her stomach at the invitation. She had been dreading this event for weeks now. The tree lighting, the crowd, the inevitable small talk. But something about Ian's presence, the way he looked at her, made her reconsider. "I might just take you up on that," she said, her voice softer than she intended. A quiet smile played at the corner of Ian's lips as he nodded. "It's a date, then." The words lingered in the air longer than they should have, hanging between them like a secret neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Amelia swallowed hard, trying to push the unease away. She wanted to tell him, wanted to make sense of this strange pull she felt toward him, but it was as if the words were trapped, lodged somewhere deep inside her. Ian broke the silence, stepping closer to her. "You okay?" His voice was low, gentle, as if sensing the shift in the air around them. Amelia nodded quickly, trying to mask the flood of emotions swirling in her chest. "Yeah, just thinking." She glanced over at the cafe, as though the building itself could offer her an escape. Ian followed her gaze before looking back at her. "You know, sometimes it's okay to stop thinking for a while," he said, his words carrying a softness that caught her off guard. She met his gaze, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to disappear. The snowflakes that had begun to fall around them caught in the light, drifting in a lazy dance, and the town seemed to come alive with the sounds of distant chatter and the faint hum of holiday music drifting from somewhere beyond. "I'm not good at stopping," Amelia admitted quietly. "I think too much, and sometimes I'm afraid of what happens if I let go." Ian's expression softened, and he took a step closer, just enough to close the space between them. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not everything has to be figured out all at once." Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt the urge to pull away, to retreat to the safety of the cafe. But there was something in his eyes, a depth she hadn't seen before, that made her want to stay, to listen, to understand. Before she could respond, the sharp ring of a bell echoed from across the street, signaling the start of the holiday parade. The town was waking up, the magic of Christmas beginning to unfurl around them. Ian smiled, breaking the moment. "I guess we should get going," he said, offering her his arm with a casual smile. "The tree lighting's about to start." Amelia hesitated, her mind racing. But then she reached out and took his arm, her fingers brushing against the warmth of his coat. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. The noise of the parade, the crowd, the expectations, all of it fading away into the background. As they walked toward the town square, the glow of the Christmas lights wrapped around them like a blanket, and Amelia found herself oddly comforted by the rhythm of their footsteps. She had never been one for large gatherings, but something about this quiet, shared moment, felt right. When they arrived at the square, the town square was alive with the bustle of families, children bundled up in scarves and hats, and the hum of excited chatter filling the air. The enormous Christmas tree stood at the center, its lights flickering with anticipation, and the scent of fresh pine mixed with the sugary sweetness of hot cocoa from the nearby stand. Ian leaned toward her as the crowd gathered, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. "You ready for this?" he asked. Amelia nodded, her heart beating faster now, not from fear, but from something she couldn't name. She was ready for this, for whatever might come next. As the countdown to the lighting began, she felt her chest tighten with excitement. The moment the first light flickered on the tree, illuminating the night sky, Amelia couldn't help but smile. The magic of Christmas was alive, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was part of it, part of something larger, something that might just change everything. Chapter 7. The Watcher's Compass. The days following the tree lighting were a blur of winter beauty and quiet reflection. Snow continued to blanket the town in a soft, shimmering layer, creating a world of silence and stillness. The holiday season was now in full swing, and the cafe had become a small oasis of warmth amid the winter chill. Amelia found herself spending more and more time behind the counter, baking and serving, losing herself in the comforting routine. It was as though the bustle of the season allowed her to momentarily forget the stirring feelings she had begun to harbor for Ian and the uncertainty that came with them. Yet, despite the busy days, her thoughts continually wandered back to him. There was something in the way he looked at her, something she couldn't quite place, that kept her on edge. She had tried to ignore it, tried to push it away, but every moment they spent together seemed to add another layer to the unspoken connection between them. She had agreed to meet him at the cafe this evening, after the last customer had left, to help him with a little project for the town's Christmas festival. The event was drawing near, and they needed to finalize the decorations for the main square. Amelia had reluctantly agreed, though a part of her was anxious. She hadn't expected to be alone with him tonight, and she wasn't sure she was ready for whatever conversation might come. As the last rays of the setting sun filtered through the window, Amelia placed the final tray of gingerbread cookies in the display case and turned off the oven. The cafe had emptied out, leaving behind the scent of cinnamon and sugar in the air. She glanced at the clock, just a few more minutes before Ian would arrive. Her pulse quickened at the thought. When the door swung open, the familiar chime sounded and Ian stepped inside, his breath visible in the cold evening air. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and he removed his scarf with a quick flick of his hands before hanging it on the coat rack by the door. "Evening," he said, his voice warm, carrying a sense of familiarity that always seemed to put her at ease. "Hope I'm not too early." "No, you're right on time," Amelia replied, offering a smile. She felt her chest tighten slightly at the sight of him, but she forced herself to breathe deeply. Tonight, she would focus on the task at hand. Nothing more, nothing less. Ian moved toward the counter, his eyes scanning the cafe. "Looks cozy in here," he said, his gaze lingering on the small Christmas tree in the corner, its lights twinkling softly in the dim light. "You've really made this place feel like home." Amelia nodded. "It's starting to feel that way," she admitted, "though I can't take all the credit. The town's got a way of making everything feel a little brighter around the holidays." Ian smiled as he leaned against the counter, his eyes meeting hers. "I think you're the one making it bright around here," he said quietly, his words carrying an unexpected weight. Amelia swallowed, unsure how to respond. She had grown used to the ease with which they interacted, but tonight, something felt different. She could feel the tension in the air, the pull between them growing stronger with each passing moment. "Shall we get started?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though the fluttering in her stomach betrayed her calm demeanor. Ian nodded, stepping toward the back room where the supplies for the decorations were stored. The town square was only days away from its big reveal, and they needed to finish the final touches. But as they worked, moving between the boxes of tinsel and ornaments, it felt as if the world outside had slowed down, leaving them in a bubble of quiet intimacy. They worked in silence for a while, the only sound the soft rustling of wrapping paper and the occasional clink of glass baubles. Every now and then, Ian would glance at her, his gaze lingering just long enough to make her heart skip a beat. Amelia tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened each time he was near, the way his presence seemed to fill the room in a way she hadn't expected. Finally, as the last ornament was placed on the shelf, Ian broke the silence. "You know, I've been thinking," he said, his voice low. "This Christmas, there's something different about it. About everything. About us." Amelia turned to him, her heart suddenly racing. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this conversation. Not yet, but it seemed inevitable now. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ian paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I don't know," he said after a moment, his gaze never leaving hers. "I just feel like there's something here. Something I can't quite explain, but I can't ignore it either." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing. She wanted to say something, to explain the whirlwind of emotions she had been feeling, but the words wouldn't come. "Ian, she began. But the door to the cafe suddenly opened, and the sound of footsteps interrupted them. Amelia and Ian both turned toward the door, and in walked an elderly woman bundled in a thick coat, her arms laden with bags of fresh produce. The woman smiled warmly at them both. "Amelia, Ian, I hope I'm not interrupting anything," she said, her voice cheerful and light. Amelia quickly regained her composure and smiled. "Of course not, Mrs. Larkin. Can I help you with anything?" The woman waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, nothing too serious. Just thought I'd pop in for a little chat. It's been a while since I've had a chance to stop by." Amelia nodded, grateful for the interruption, even though she felt a twinge of disappointment. She had been on the brink of saying something important, but now the moment had slipped away, lost to the everyday happenings of life. She glanced at Ian, but he was already walking toward the front door, a warm smile on his face. "Well, I should let you two catch up," he said with a chuckle. "I'll finish up the last bit of work on the square and meet you tomorrow for the final touches. You're doing a great job, Amelia." His words were kind, but there was something in his tone, something bittersweet, that made her heart ache. She nodded, but couldn't bring herself to speak. She watched him step out into the snowy evening, the doors swinging closed behind him, leaving her with a quiet emptiness that echoed in her chest. As she turned back to Mrs. Larkin, who was now carefully inspecting the jars of preserves on the counter, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something irreversible. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the town in a world of white. And as the day faded into night, Amelia realized that she was no longer sure where the path ahead would lead, but she knew that it would be one she couldn't walk alone. Chapter 8. Fragments of Fire. The days before Christmas seemed to stretch endlessly, each one marked by the soft flicker of lights, the scent of pine, and the constant hum of holiday preparations. Amelia had always loved the quiet rhythm of the season, but this year, everything felt different. The days were filled with a sense of anticipation, a feeling of something just out of reach, waiting to be discovered. The town was alive with the bustle of Christmas shoppers, children racing through the streets, and the sweet melody of carols drifting through the air. Yet, despite the cheer, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of something. Something big, something important. She just didn't know what. She spent the morning in the cafe, baking batches of cookies and wrapping gift boxes for the customers who had been coming in with an urgency only the days before Christmas could bring. The town was bustling, and Amelia found herself lost in the steady rhythm of it all. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the snow-dusted streets, a familiar figure stepped into the cafe. Ian walked in, his coat dusted with the snow that had begun to fall in thick, swirling flakes. He smiled as he caught her eye, his usual warmth drawing her in despite the cold that seemed to hang in the air. He was early, as he often was, and his presence had become something of a comforting constant in her life these past few weeks. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying the same ease as always. "Hi, Ian," Amelia replied, her smile soft but genuine. She had been thinking about him all day, and as much as she tried to focus on the tasks in front of her, her thoughts always seemed to wander back to him. There was something about the way he made her feel, something that both unsettled and excited her all at once. Ian glanced around the cafe, taking in the cozy atmosphere. "I see you're still keeping things festive in here," he remarked, his gaze lingering on the decorations that adorned the walls and the small tree in the corner, now fully decked out in twinkling lights. Amelia nodded, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "It's the season. I figured I'd make the most of it." His eyes softened as he looked at her, the glimmer of admiration in them unmistakable. "You've done more than just make the most of it, Amelia. You've brought something special to this place." Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she struggled to keep her composure. There was something in his voice, in his words, that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She quickly turned away, focusing on the task of wiping down the counter. "Well, thank you," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "I'm just doing my part to make it a Merry Christmas around here." Ian didn't respond immediately, but his gaze never wavered. The silence between them felt heavy, charged with unspoken thoughts and feelings that neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge. Finally, he cleared his throat and stepped closer to the counter. "I came to ask if you might want to take a walk tonight," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "The snow's really starting to come down." and it looks like it'll be one of those nights that makes everything feel magical. Amelia's heart fluttered in her chest, and she paused, uncertain. She had been hoping for a chance to spend time with Ian, but the reality of it, of being alone with him, of stepping into that uncharted territory, was both thrilling and terrifying. She glanced at the clock on the wall. The cafe was quiet, and the evening felt like it was stretching out in front of her, waiting. "I'd like that," she said, her voice steady but betraying a hint of the nerves that had begun to settle in her stomach. Ian smiled, the warmth of it enough to melt some of the tension she'd been holding on to. "Great. Let's go then. There's something about walking in the snow that makes everything feel lighter." Amelia grabbed her coat from the back room and joined him at the door. The sound of the snow crunching beneath their boots was the only noise as they stepped out into the crisp evening air. The streets were nearly empty, the occasional car passing by, but the town was quiet now, wrapped in a blanket of snow that seemed to dull the world's usual clamor. The lights from the cafe spilled out onto the sidewalk behind them, casting long shadows as they made their way down the street. For a few moments, they walked side by side, the silence between them comfortable, yet heavy with anticipation. The snowflakes fell in a steady stream, drifting lazily from the sky and settling on their coats, turning the world into a dreamlike landscape. The glow from the streetlights reflected off the snow, creating a soft, ethereal light that bathed everything in a gentle glow. "So," Ian began, breaking the silence, "what do you think of this weather? Is it too much?" Amelia smiled at the question. "I think it's perfect," she said. "There's something about snow that makes everything feel new, like everything's being covered up and given a second chance." He nodded thoughtfully. "I like that," he said. "A second chance. I think the holidays have a way of doing that for people." Amelia's chest tightened at the thought. A second chance. Was that what she was hoping for? She had been running from her past for so long, afraid to confront the things that had shaped her, afraid to let herself feel anything too deeply. But standing here with Ian, in the middle of the quiet, snowy street, she felt a pull, a quiet yearning for something more. They continued walking, their breath misting in the cold air. As they reached the town square, the Christmas tree stood tall, its lights sparkling in the distance. The square was empty now, save for a few stray cars parked along the edge, and the town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the night to unfold. Ian stopped at the edge of the square, turning to face her. "Do you ever wonder, Amelia," he asked, his voice low and serious, "if the holidays are just a way for us to remember what we've lost, or if they're a chance for us to find something new?" Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected the question, but now that it was out there, she realized how much she had been wondering the same thing. Was this just another Christmas, another year to get through, or was it a chance for something more? "I think it's both," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had been avoiding. "A little bit of both." Ian stepped closer to her, his expression thoughtful, as if he was weighing the words carefully. "Maybe it's just about giving ourselves permission to feel again," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "To let go of the things that hold us back and embrace the things that are still waiting for us." Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him, her heart racing. The space between them seemed to disappear, and for a moment, all she could hear was the steady beat of her own heart. "I think you're right," she whispered. Ian smiled, a slow, knowing smile that seemed to light up his entire face. "Good," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "because I think this is just the beginning." And as the snow continued to fall around them, Amelia realized that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of what might come next. Chapter 9. The Whispering Pines. The wind had picked up the following morning, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter and the promise of more snow. Amelia wrapped herself tighter in her scarf as she stepped out of the cafe, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The streets were empty, save for a few early risers hurrying about their business, their footsteps muffled by the deepening snow that blanketed the town. It was a quiet, peaceful morning, and for a brief moment, Amelia allowed herself to simply enjoy the stillness. It had been days since that evening walk with Ian, but the memory of it lingered like a soft melody in the back of her mind. His words, the quiet promise that had passed between them, seemed to echo with each step she took. There was a shift in the air now, a sense that something was changing, something that she couldn't quite grasp, but it was there, lingering in the spaces between her thoughts. As she reached the cafe, she paused, looking up at the small building, its windows glowing warmly in the dim light of the early morning. The sight of it always brought a sense of comfort, but today, it felt different. It felt like the start of something new. She stepped inside, the door chiming softly as she entered. The warmth of the cafe enveloped her, and the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee and baking pastries greeted her senses. She was alone for the moment, and she took a moment to breathe, letting the quiet hum of the cafe settle around her. It wasn't long before the bell above the door jingled again, and Ian walked in. He looked different this morning, his eyes brighter, his step lighter, as if the world had shifted beneath his feet in some subtle way. He gave her a quick smile as he crossed the threshold, his gaze catching hers as if by design. "Morning," he said, his voice warm, but there was an undercurrent to it, something unspoken, something that made Amelia's heart beat a little faster. "Morning," she replied, her voice steady, though her hands betrayed her. They shook slightly as she wiped down the counter, a nervous energy stirring in her chest. Ian approached the counter, his gaze never leaving hers. "I thought I'd stop by before the day really gets going," he said. "I've got a few things I need to finish up for the festival tonight, but I figured I could use a little break." Amelia nodded, offering him a smile, but she could feel the weight of the moment hanging between them. The cafe was still quiet, the early morning light filtering through the windows and casting long shadows across the floor. It was peaceful, but there was something beneath the surface, something that neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice soft, though she wasn't sure if she really wanted the answer. Ian hesitated for a moment before speaking, his eyes searching hers. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what we talked about the other night, about second chances and what the holidays really mean. I guess I'm wondering if I've been missing something all this time." Amelia's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't bring herself to speak. She had known that Ian was searching for something. She just hadn't expected him to voice it so openly. It was as if he had read the unspoken words that had been circling between them for days, words she hadn't yet found the courage to say herself. "I think we all miss something sometimes," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "Maybe it's a part of who we are, or maybe it's just the way life moves. But I think sometimes we have to let ourselves feel lost before we can find our way." Ian stepped closer, the space between them narrowing until it was just a breath away. "And what if we find our way together?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though the question itself was fragile, delicate. Amelia's heart raced, and the world seemed to slow down around them. She could feel the weight of his words, the promise in them, the possibility of something more. It was as if the snow outside had created a cocoon around them, a quiet space where time didn't matter, where only the two of them existed. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling with the uncertainty of it all. "I think we'd have to take it one step at a time." Ian nodded, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "One step at a time," he repeated, as if the words themselves were a promise. For a long moment, they stood there, the weight of their shared silence more powerful than anything spoken. Amelia could feel the pull between them, the unspoken bond that had formed over the past few weeks. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. Finally, Ian broke the silence, his voice steady and calm. "I was wondering if you'd like to join me tonight," he said. "The festival. I've been working on it for weeks, and it would mean a lot to have you there. It's not just the town's Christmas celebration. It's everything we've been working toward. I think it's going to be something special." Amelia smiled, the warmth of his words settling in her chest like a familiar comfort. "I'd love to," she said, her voice steady now, her heart finally at ease. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Ian smiled, his eyes lighting up in a way that made Amelia's heart flutter. "I'm glad," he said. "I think this Christmas is going to be one we won't forget." As he turned to leave, his hand brushing against hers as he passed, Amelia stood there for a moment, watching him go. The door chimed as it closed behind him, and she was left alone in the quiet cafe, her heart still racing from the weight of the conversation, from the promise of what was to come. Outside, the snow continued to fall, the world outside blanketed in a layer of white. It felt like the perfect backdrop to what was happening inside her heart. She wasn't sure where this path with Ian would lead, but for the first time, she was ready to follow it. And as she stood there, beneath the soft glow of the cafe lights, Amelia realized that the Christmas season was more than just a time for tradition and celebration. It was a time for new beginnings, for second chances, and for the possibility of love. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something beautiful. Chapter 10. A Map of Lost Stars. The evening air was thick with the sound of laughter and music as the town square came alive with the glow of festive lights. The streets were lined with stalls, each one offering something special. Homemade ornaments, warm mugs of cocoa, and the sweet smell of roasted chestnuts wafting through the air. The Christmas festival had officially begun, and the entire town seemed to be gathered beneath the sparkling lights, all united by the magic of the season. Amelia stood at the edge of the square, the crowd swirling around her, her eyes scanning the faces for Ian. She could feel the energy of the evening, the excitement in the air, and despite her usual calm demeanor, she couldn't help but feel a flutter of nervous anticipation. The festival had been Ian's project for weeks now, and she knew how much it meant to him. It was his way of giving back to the town, of creating something that would last beyond the season. And yet, as much as she admired the work he had put into it, there was a small part of her that was uncertain. Tonight, it felt like everything was leading to this moment. She wrapped her coat tighter around her, the chill of the night creeping in despite the warmth of the crowd. Her breath puffed out in small clouds, mingling with the snowflakes that drifted down from the sky. The snow had stopped falling for the moment, but the ground was already covered in a thick blanket of white. The world felt still, as if time had paused just for them. It wasn't long before she spotted Ian across the square, his broad shoulders standing out amidst the crowd. He was talking with a few of the other festival organizers, but the moment his eyes landed on her, everything else seemed to fade away. A smile spread across his face, and he excused himself from the group, making his way toward her. "Amelia," he said, his voice a mixture of excitement and relief. "You made it. I wouldn't miss it," she replied, her voice soft but steady. She could feel the warmth of his presence, the way he always seemed to make everything feel a little brighter. "It looks amazing," she added, taking in the vibrant lights, the bustling crowd, the sounds of holiday cheer that filled the air. Ian's eyes softened as he looked around, his pride in the event evident. "It's everything I hoped for," he said, his voice a little quieter now, almost reverent. "But it's better now that you're here." Amelia's heart fluttered at his words, and for a moment, She was caught in the depth of his gaze. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel like the center of the universe, as if all the noise of the festival had faded away, leaving just the two of them in their own little world. "I'm glad I could be here with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is really something special. It's all for the town," Ian said, his smile widening. "But it's also for people like you, who've helped me make it happen. You've been a part of it from the very beginning, and I can't thank you enough for that." Amelia's chest tightened at his words. There was a sincerity in his voice, a depth of feeling that made her heart ache in the best possible way. She had come to care for him more than she had allowed herself to admit, and as she stood there, surrounded by the twinkling lights and the hum of the crowd, she realized that this moment, this evening, felt like the culmination of something she hadn't even known she was searching for. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, yet full of meaning, "for everything, for inviting me into this, for letting me be part of it." Ian reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture so simple, yet so significant. He didn't say anything at first, just held her gaze, and in that silence, they both seemed to understand. There was something unspoken between them, a connection that neither of them had been able to put into words, but that felt stronger with every passing day. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night," Ian finally said, his voice low. "About second chances. About how sometimes we have to let ourselves feel lost before we can find our way." Amelia's heart skipped a beat, and she nodded slowly. "I think about that a lot, too. I think sometimes we have to let go of the things that hold us back, even if it's hard, even if it feels impossible." Ian's eyes softened, and he stepped a little closer, his presence so warm, so steady. "I think we're both learning that," he said, his voice filled with an understanding that made her heart swell. "And maybe, just maybe, this is our chance to find something new. Together." The words hung in the air between them, soft and fragile, like the snowflakes that continued to fall gently from the sky. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need to. The promise of something more was in the air, something that neither of them had fully acknowledged, but both of them could feel deep in their bones. The sound of music began to swell around them, the first notes of a carol drifting over the square. A group of children ran past, their laughter ringing out in the cold night air, and Amelia's heart lifted at the sight of it all. There was a magic in the air, a sense that anything was possible, that the world was full of second chances and new beginnings. "I think this is the start of something amazing," Ian said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I don't know what it looks like yet, but I'm ready to find out. Are you?" Amelia took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over her like a warm embrace. She knew, deep down, that this was it. This was the beginning of something new, something beautiful, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace it. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady and sure. "I'm ready." The music swelled as the first notes of Silent Night played through the square, and the crowd around them began to gather closer, joining in the song. Amelia and Ian stood there, side by side, as the town came alive around them. The snow continued to fall, the lights twinkling like stars in the dark sky, and for a moment, it felt as if the world had paused just for them. In that quiet, fleeting moment, Amelia knew that this Christmas, this time, this place, was where it all began. And whatever the future held, she was ready to face it, hand in hand with Ian, beneath the winter sky. Chapter 11. The North Wind's Clue. The morning after the festival was quiet, the world still and peaceful beneath the thick blanket of snow that had fallen through the night. The streets, once filled with the buzz of the previous evening's celebration, were now hushed, almost reverent in their silence. The town seemed to be resting, taking a breath after the whirlwind of the holiday festivities, and so too did Amelia. She sat at the window of the cafe, her gaze fixed on the snow falling gently outside, her thoughts drifting in a way that felt both calming and unsettling. The memories of the festival, of the laughter and the warmth, swirled in her mind like the snowflakes, each one unique, each one carrying its own significance. But beneath that warmth, something deeper had begun to stir. It was more than the joy of the season or the happiness of being surrounded by friends and strangers alike. It was a quiet realization, one that had crept up on her slowly, as if the pieces had always been there, waiting to be connected. She hadn't realized just how much she had come to care for Ian until that night, until the way his hand had brushed hers, his words hanging in the air between them like a promise that neither of them had fully acknowledged. And now, in the stillness of this morning, she found herself wondering what the next step would be. What did it mean to let go of the past, to embrace a future she hadn't expected? The cafe door opened with a soft jingle, breaking her reverie. She looked up, a smile curling at the corners of her mouth as Ian stepped inside, shaking the snow from his coat before hanging it on the rack by the door. His eyes found hers almost immediately, and for a brief moment, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. "Morning," he said, his voice warm, his smile easy. "I thought I'd stop by before I head out. I've got a few things to finish up, but I didn't want to leave without seeing you." Amelia's heart gave a little lurch at his words, and she couldn't quite suppress the warmth that spread through her chest. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. "I'm glad you did," she said, her voice steady, though there was a slight tremor in it that she couldn't quite control. Ian took a seat across from her, his gaze never leaving hers. He studied her for a moment, his expression soft, almost as if he were trying to read something in her eyes. Amelia met his gaze without hesitation, though the words she wanted to say felt like they were stuck somewhere deep inside her, tangled up with everything she was feeling. The silence between them stretched for a moment, comfortable but charged with an unspoken understanding. Then, Ian spoke again, his tone quieter, more introspective than usual. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, "about how much has changed since we met, how much the town has changed, and how much I've changed." Amelia's heart skipped a beat, the weight of his words settling into her chest. She wasn't sure where this conversation would lead, but she could feel the gravity of it, the way it hinted at something deeper, something that was finally ready to be explored. "I think we both have," she replied softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, the motion grounding her as she spoke. "But maybe that's the point, isn't it? Sometimes, we don't realize how much we need to change until we're given the chance to. And sometimes, that chance comes when we least expect it." Ian nodded slowly, his gaze drifting down to the table between them, his fingers tapping lightly on the wood. "Yeah, I didn't expect any of this. Not the cafe, not the festival, not you. I didn't expect to find something that felt so real, so important." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. There it was, the unspoken truth that had been building between them for weeks, and she knew that in this moment, it was finally time to acknowledge it. "And what do you think it means?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was no mistaking the weight of the question. Ian looked up at her, his eyes dark with emotion, and for a moment, Amelia thought he might say something, but he was silent, just watching her with a gaze so intense it made her heart race. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet certainty. "I think it means that we're exactly where we're supposed to be," he said. "That we've both been through enough to know that there's something worth holding on to. And I think I want to hold on to this. To you." Amelia's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing. The simplicity of his words, the sincerity with which he spoke them, left her feeling as though the entire world had shifted beneath her feet. It was as if he had answered the question she hadn't even fully asked herself. "I want to hold on to this, too," she said, her voice soft but filled with meaning. She reached across the table, her hand resting gently over his. The touch was fleeting, but it carried with it a promise, a quiet understanding that the bond between them had deepened beyond words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside continued to spin, the sound of the wind and the soft murmur of the town filtering in through the window. But inside the cafe, time seemed to slow. There was a stillness, a calm certainty in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Amelia felt like she had finally found her place. "I know it's not going to be easy," Ian said after a moment, breaking the silence, "but I want to take that chance. I want to see where this goes with you." Amelia nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "I'm ready," she whispered, the words feeling more like a declaration than a response. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. She was ready to take the next step. And as the snow continued to fall outside, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The tapestry of moments that had brought them here. So many little threads, so many unexpected turns, had woven something beautiful, something worth holding on to. And Amelia knew, deep down, that whatever came next, she was ready to face it, hand in hand with Ian, as the winter world outside embraced them in its quiet, timeless beauty. Chapter 12. The Veil of Aurora. The days leading up to Christmas had a sense of urgency to them, a flurry of activity that seemed to mirror the snowfall that had continued to blanket the town. The streets sparkled with holiday lights, the town square buzzed with the scent of freshly baked cookies, and the air was filled with the soft hum of anticipation. But despite the festive atmosphere, Amelia couldn't help but feel a quiet, persistent pull inside her. A pull to pause, to reflect, and to understand what was truly shifting beneath the surface. She sat by the window at the cafe, a steaming mug of coffee cradled between her hands, watching as the snow drifted lazily from the sky. It was late afternoon, the golden light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the town. The streets were busy with people rushing to finish their holiday shopping, but Amelia felt removed from it all, as if the world outside was moving at a pace she could no longer match. There was something about the stillness of the season, the way the snow covered everything in its soft embrace, that made everything feel suspended in time. It was in these moments of quiet that she found herself reflecting on the changes that had come into her life so unexpectedly. Ian had become a constant presence in her days, in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the shared moments at the cafe or the simple exchanges during the festival preparations. It was the way his words lingered with her long after their conversations had ended, the way his touch, no matter how brief, seemed to ground her in a way she hadn't known she needed. And more than anything, it was the way he made her feel seen, truly seen, in a way she hadn't realized she'd been missing. But with that realization came a quiet, nagging question. What did it all mean? What did it mean to open up to someone again, to let them in after years of carefully guarding her heart? And what if it was too soon, too risky, too much to ask? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the door opening, and she looked up to see Ian stepping inside, his cheeks flushed from the cold and a smile on his lips. He removed his gloves slowly, his eyes scanning the room before landing on her. "Hey," he greeted, his voice warm and familiar. "I brought you something." Amelia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What is it?" Ian pulled a small bundle from beneath his coat and placed it on the table in front of her. Amelia looked down to see a delicate little star-shaped ornament, its surface glittering in the soft light. It was made of what looked like silver threads, intricately woven into a star pattern. She reached out to touch it, feeling the coolness of the metal beneath her fingertips. "It's for the cafe," Ian explained, sitting down across from her. "I thought it might be a nice addition to the tree. You know, since we've been talking about bringing a little more magic into this place." Amelia smiled, the gesture so simple yet meaningful. The thoughtfulness of the gift, the way it seemed to reflect the quiet hope that had been growing between them, made her heart swell. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "Thank you." Ian leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching hers with a quiet intensity. "You're welcome," he said, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken emotion. "I know we've been figuring things out, but I just wanted to remind you that I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." Amelia's heart gave a soft flutter at his words. It was the reassurance she had needed, though she hadn't known how badly she craved it until now. She met his gaze, the weight of his promise settling over her like a warm blanket. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I'm here too." The words were simple, but they carried with them a sense of shared understanding, a mutual commitment to something that was slowly taking shape between them. There were still so many uncertainties, so many questions about what the future held, but for the first time, Amelia felt a deep sense of peace. She wasn't sure where their journey would lead, but in this moment, she knew that she wasn't facing it alone. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the world outside seeming to fade as they simply existed in this small, quiet corner of the cafe. The snow continued to fall gently outside, covering the town in a layer of soft white, and as the light from the street lamps filtered through the window, casting a golden glow on the room, Amelia realized something she hadn't allowed herself to see before. She had found a place in this world, a place she wanted to stay. "I think this Christmas is going to be different," she said softly, breaking the silence. "In a good way." Ian smiled, his eyes warm with something more than just affection. "I think you're right," he replied, his voice low. "This Christmas feels like the beginning of something new. Something we didn't even know we needed." Amelia nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep in her chest. It wasn't just the season that was changing, it was them, too. Together, they were building something real, something lasting, and it felt like the first real hope she had allowed herself to feel in a long time. "You know," she said after a pause, "I used to think Christmas was just about the traditions, the decorations, the gifts, but now, I think it's about moments like this. It's about finding the magic in the quiet, in the simple things." Ian's smile deepened, and he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. The gesture was small, but it was enough to speak volumes. Amelia could feel the warmth of his touch, the reassurance of his presence, and for the first time, she allowed herself to fully embrace it, to accept it, to trust it. "I think you're right," Ian said, his voice steady and sincere. "And I think we've found our own kind of magic." The sound of a distant carol drifted through the window, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed to pause, as if everything was in perfect harmony. Amelia looked at Ian, her heart full, and in that moment, she realized that no matter what the future held, she was ready to face it. With him, with the town, with the magic of the season that had brought them both here. And as the snow continued to fall outside, she couldn't help but feel that the tapestry of her life was slowly, but surely, weaving together into something beautiful. Chapter 13. When the Stars Align. The week before Christmas was always a whirlwind of activity in the town of Willowbrook. Every corner of the town seemed to be alive with the hum of the season. The scent of pine and cinnamon wafting through the air, the laughter of children playing in the snow, and the twinkling lights that lit up the streets like stars scattered across the night. But for Amelia, the days were taking on a quieter, more reflective quality. She had always loved the energy of Christmas, the hustle, the bustle, the festive chaos. But this year, Something about the stillness of the season was pulling her in. It wasn't the decorations or the crowds of people that filled her with the holiday spirit. It was the way the world seemed to slow down, how the snow muffled everything in its soft embrace, how the world outside her window seemed to stop for a breath. And it was Ian. Their relationship had evolved in a way neither of them had expected. There was an ease between them now, a sense of comfort that had grown steadily since the festival. It was in the way they shared quiet moments at the cafe, the small touches, the unspoken understanding that had taken root between them. But as much as the connection between them was growing, there was still a hesitation in Amelia's heart. A part of her, deep down, was afraid to fully trust in the promise of this moment, afraid that the world could change as quickly as it had come together. Amelia sat at the small table by the window, the cafe unusually quiet for the late afternoon. It was a rare lull in the day, a moment where the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving her with her thoughts. She watched the snow fall in soft, delicate flakes, each one a fleeting moment of beauty in the world's chaotic dance. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. She glanced down to see a message from Ian. "Hey, I'll be by in about an hour. Got something for you." Amelia smiled softly at the message, her heart giving a little flutter. She had grown accustomed to these small, thoughtful gestures from Ian, each one a quiet reminder that he was there, that he cared in ways that were simple but meaningful. But despite the warmth his presence brought, there was a part of her that still wondered about the future, about what all of this meant. She was startled out of her thoughts as the door opened with the familiar jingle, and a gust of cold air swept in. She turned to see Ian standing in the doorway, a grin on his face as he shook the snow from his coat. There was a certain lightness to him today, a spring in his step that made her wonder what he was up to. "Hey," he said, his voice bright as he walked toward her. "I brought you something." He placed a small package wrapped in festive paper on the table in front of her. Amelia raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Ian leaned in closer, his grin widening. "It's a surprise." She carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a small, antique-looking key. It was delicate, with intricate carvings along the shaft, and it looked like it could open a treasure chest rather than any door she had seen. She picked it up gently, running her fingers along its cool surface. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with curiosity. "What is it?" Ian sat down across from her, watching her closely as he spoke. "It's a key to something I've been working on, something I thought would be the perfect gift for you, especially with Christmas coming up." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. The mystery of the gift intrigued her, but it was more than that. It was the way Ian spoke, the way his eyes held hers as he waited for her reaction. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her feel like the whole world was holding its breath. "I've been restoring the old cabin on the edge of town," he continued, his voice a little quieter now. "It's been sitting empty for years, but it's a piece of Willowbrook history. I thought maybe you'd want to see it, to see what I've been working on." Amelia's heart raced as she processed his words. The old cabin was a piece of town lore, a place that had been abandoned for as long as she could remember. The idea that Ian had been restoring it, working on it in secret, felt like something out of a fairy tale. She looked down at the key in her hand, feeling a sense of wonder wash over her. "This is incredible," she said, her voice filled with awe. "You've been working on that cabin?" Ian nodded, his eyes softening. "I thought it might be a way to give something back to the town, to bring a little bit of history back to life. And I thought you might like to see it, especially since you've always been drawn to the past." Amelia felt a lump rise in her throat at his words. There was something so genuine in his voice, something so heartfelt, that it made her feel like this moment was more than just a surprise. It was a gesture of trust, of opening up to her in a way that was so rare, so deeply personal. "I'd love to see it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'd love that more than anything." Ian smiled, relief and happiness flooding his features. "I'm glad. I think it's going to be something really special when it's finished." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the gift settling between them. It wasn't just the key or the cabin itself that had made this moment so significant. It was the way Ian had shared it with her, the way he had invited her into his world, into something that mattered deeply to him. It felt like the first real step towards something more, something lasting. "I've been thinking a lot," Amelia said after a while, her voice quiet, but filled with a new sense of clarity, "about what we've been building, about where we're going. And I think I'm ready for whatever comes next. With you, with the town, with everything." Ian's expression softened, and he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. Amelia felt her heart settle, the uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks finally beginning to lift. "I'm glad to hear that," Ian said softly, "because I'm ready too." The moment between them hung in the air, charged with meaning, as the world outside continued its quiet dance of snow and winter. The town of Willowbrook was preparing for Christmas, but for Amelia, it felt as though something even more significant was unfolding before her eyes. The old cabin, the key, and Ian's quiet confession had opened a door in her heart, one she hadn't even known was there. And as she sat there, holding his hand, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Chapter 14. The Last Midnight. The week before Christmas was a delicate balance of anticipation and calm, a pause before the final rush of the holiday season. In the heart of Willowbrook, the quiet seemed to grow thicker with each passing day, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the final crescendo of celebration. For Amelia, though, the world outside felt more distant than ever, as she found herself wrapped in the warmth of something she had only just begun to understand. It had been days since Ian had given her the key to the cabin, and the weight of it still lingered in her thoughts. She had been eager to see the cabin, to witness the transformation that Ian had been working on in secret, but part of her had hesitated, uncertain of what it meant to step into his world in such an intimate way. The cabin was not just a place. It was a piece of history, a project that had become a reflection of Ian himself, and that knowledge made her both excited and apprehensive. The snow had fallen steadily for days, a soft, continuous blanket that coated the town in a pristine layer of white. The cafe was quieter than usual, with most of the regulars opting to stay home to prepare for the holiday rush. Amelia found herself alone at the counter, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee as she stared out the window, lost in thought. The town was still, save for the occasional car passing through the streets or the distant laughter of children playing in the snow. The tranquility of it all made her feel like she was on the edge of something new, something unknown. A soft jingle of the cafe door broke the silence, and Amelia turned to see Ian stepping inside, his presence as familiar as it was comforting. He was dressed warmly in a thick sweater and a coat, the chill of the winter air still clinging to him. He smiled at her as he shook off the snow, his eyes lighting up as they met hers. "Hey," he said, his voice warm and easy. "Ready to see the cabin?" Amelia felt a flutter in her chest at his words. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was finally here, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She nodded, standing up from her seat and walking toward him. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions beneath the surface. Ian reached into his pocket and pulled out the small key, holding it up between them. The silver key gleamed in the light, its intricate design as beautiful as it was mysterious. "This is it," Ian said, his voice soft but filled with meaning. "This is the key to a new chapter, for both of us." Amelia felt her heart skip a beat. There was something in the way Ian said it, something that made her realize just how much this moment mattered. It wasn't just about the cabin. It was about what they were building together, what they were discovering in each other. "I think it's going to be something special," Amelia replied, her voice barely a whisper. Ian smiled, and with a simple nod, he turned toward the door. Amelia followed him out into the cold, the snow crunching beneath their feet as they made their way toward the edge of town. The old cabin wasn't far from the center, nestled on a small hill that overlooked the town. From a distance, it had always seemed like a forgotten relic, its time long past. But as they approached, Amelia saw it with new eyes. The cabin was not just an abandoned building. It was a home, a story waiting to be told. Ian led the way, and as they approached the door, he unlocked it with the key. The sound of the old lock turning echoed in the stillness of the winter air, and Amelia felt a rush of anticipation flood through her. The door creaked open, revealing the dark interior of the cabin, and Ian stepped aside to let her enter first. Amelia hesitated for only a moment before stepping over the threshold. The air inside was cool but smelled of wood and history, as though the cabin had been waiting for this moment for years. The walls were lined with the bones of the past, old beams that had stood the test of time, wooden floors that had weathered countless storms. It was a space that seemed to breathe with the weight of its history, and yet there was a warmth in the air, a feeling that it was slowly coming back to life. "This place is incredible," Amelia whispered, her voice reverberating in the quiet. Ian nodded, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet pride. "It's been a labor of love," he said. "I've been working on it for months, and I wanted to make sure it felt like, well, like home." They walked through the cabin together, exploring the rooms that Ian had carefully restored. The living room, with its stone fireplace, was cozy and inviting, the fire already crackling in the hearth. The kitchen had been updated with modern touches, but still held the charm of its original design, with exposed wood beams and a large farmhouse table at the center. Everywhere she looked, Amelia saw evidence of Ian's hard work, his dedication, and his love for the place. It wasn't just a building, it was a reflection of him. As they made their way to the second floor, Ian stopped in front of a small room at the end of the hallway. He opened the door and gestured for Amelia to enter first. Inside, the room was small but filled with light, the window overlooking the town below. It had been transformed into a cozy reading nook, with a soft armchair and shelves lined with books. A small desk sat by the window, a perfect place to write or reflect. Amelia walked to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered streets below. The sight of the town, so peaceful and quiet, filled her with a sense of contentment. "This room is my favorite," Ian said, his voice soft behind her. "I think it's where I'll spend most of my time once everything is finished. It feels like the heart of the cabin." Amelia turned to face him, her heart swelling with a mix of emotion. She could feel it too. The way this place seemed to pulse with life, with potential, with the promise of something new. She looked at Ian, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the firelight, and she realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for. This wasn't just a cabin. It was a new beginning. "This place is more than I imagined," Amelia said, her voice thick with emotion. It's perfect." Ian smiled, his eyes tender as he looked at her. "I'm glad you like it, and I'm glad you're here with me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning, and Amelia felt her heart open in a way it hadn't in years. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of what the future might bring. With Ian by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. As the light from the fire flickered in the room, Amelia took a step closer to Ian, her hand brushing against his. The connection between them was undeniable, and in that moment, she knew that this cabin, this place, was the beginning of something much bigger than either of them had imagined. It was the start of a story they would write together, a story of love, of home, and of the magic of Christmas. Chapter 15. A Star for Christmas. Christmas Eve arrived in Willowbrook with a soft, serene grace, like a blanket of snow covering the world in quiet splendor. The air was crisp and sharp, each breath of winter filling the lungs with a sense of clarity and renewal. The streets were lined with festive lights, their glow casting a warm and inviting light on the snowy path ahead. The town seemed to shimmer, alive with the spirit of the season, and yet, despite the cheer that enveloped the town, there was a stillness in Amelia's heart that had settled deeper over the past few days. The cabin, still a work in progress but now filled with life, had become her refuge in these final days leading up to Christmas. It was there, with Ian by her side, that she had begun to truly understand what it meant to be present, to be fully immersed in the moment without fear of what the future might hold. And yet, as the holiday neared, she could feel a quiet tension building inside her. The magic of Christmas, the joy that seemed to flood the town, contrasted with the uncertainty she still held within herself. Was she ready to let go of her past fears and embrace the future? Was she ready to fully commit to what she had found with Ian? The cafe had been bustling that morning with the usual holiday rush. Orders for cookies, hot cocoa, and Christmas pies flying in and out of the kitchen, each moment a blur of festive energy. But now, in the late afternoon, the cafe had quieted down. The last of the customers had filtered out, and the warm glow of the cafe's lights reflected off the snow-covered streets outside. Amelia stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface, her thoughts miles away. The door jingled, and she glanced up to see Ian entering, his coat dusted with snowflakes from the walk-over. "Hey," he greeted her with a smile that always seemed to lift her spirits. "I was hoping I'd catch you before you closed up." Amelia returned the smile, her heart giving a little flutter. "I'm just about finished here. What's up?" Ian's expression softened, and there was a quiet intensity in his gaze as he walked closer. "I was thinking we should go somewhere tonight. I mean, after everything the town's been through, after all the craziness, I think we both deserve to take a step back and just enjoy the night. No distractions, just us. What do you think?" Amelia's heart stirred at his words. She had been so focused on everything around her, the cabin, the cafe, the holiday preparations, that she hadn't stopped to simply be, to enjoy the quiet moments with Ian without the weight of expectation or the rush of the season. Maybe it was just what she needed. "That sounds perfect," she replied, her voice soft but filled with warmth. "Where did you have in mind?" Ian hesitated for a moment, as if he were searching for the right words. "I thought we could head out to the lake. It's a bit of a drive, but I know a place by the water where we can see the stars. It's peaceful out there." The thought of the lake filled Amelia with a sense of calm. She had always been drawn to water, the way it could reflect both the world around it and the emotions within. It seemed fitting, somehow, that they would share this moment at the edge of the world, where everything was still and quiet. "I'd love that," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Let's go." Within the hour, they were driving through the snow-covered streets of Willowbrook, the car gliding over the slick roads as they made their way to the edge of town. The landscape outside was breathtaking, the world bathed in the soft, silvery light of the moon, with the trees standing like sentinels on either side of the road. As they neared the lake, Amelia could see the outline of the water through the trees, the surface still and reflective, like a mirror of the night sky. They parked near a small clearing that overlooked the water. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their boots as they stepped out of the car. The air was cold, but it felt refreshing, filling Amelia's lungs with a sharp clarity. She glanced at Ian, who had already begun walking toward the water, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, his face turned toward the sky. "This place is incredible," Amelia whispered as she caught up to him. The stars above them seemed to shimmer more brightly in the stillness of the night, their light reflecting off the water like diamonds scattered across the sky. Ian stopped and turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "I've always loved it here," he said quietly. "There's something about the stillness, the way the world seems to slow down. It's the kind of place where you can just breathe." Amelia nodded, her gaze drawn to the water, where the reflection of the stars danced on the surface. I know what you mean. It feels like time stands still here. They stood in silence for a few moments, the cold air and the quiet beauty of the lake wrapping around them like a cocoon. Amelia felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders as she breathed in the crisp air, her heart slowing to match the stillness of the night. She was aware of Ian's presence beside her, of the way his warmth seemed to seep into her, even in the cold of winter. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Amelia said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "About us. About everything." Ian turned to look at her, his expression softening. "What about everything?" She took a deep breath, her heart thumping in her chest. "I've been afraid. Afraid of opening up, afraid of what might happen if I let go of my past. But being here, with you, it's making me realize that maybe it's time. Time to let go, to stop holding back." Ian reached out and took her hand in his touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice low and comforting. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. We'll take it one step at a time together." Amelia's heart swelled with emotion as she looked into his eyes, the sincerity in his gaze making her feel like she was seen in a way she had never felt before. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to fully embrace the moment, to let go of the fears that had held her back. They stood there for a long while, hand in hand, watching the stars above and the water below, as the world around them seemed to hold its breath. In that stillness, with the gentle whispers of the wind and the distant sounds of the lake, Amelia realized that she had found something she hadn't known she was searching for, not just in Ian, but in herself. The courage to face whatever came next, to be present in the now, and to let the future unfold in its own time. As the night wore on, they sat together on the snow-covered ground, wrapped in the quiet beauty of the moment. The stars overhead, the lake before them, and the warmth between them. It was all a gift, one that Amelia knew she would carry with her long after the snow had melted and the holiday season had passed. They stood there for a long while, hand in hand, watching the stars above and the water below, as the world around them seemed to hold its breath. In that stillness, with the gentle whispers of the wind and the distant sounds of the lake, Amelia realized that she had found something she hadn't known she was searching for, not just in Ian, but in herself. The courage to face whatever came next, to be present in the now, and to let the future unfold in its own time. As the night wore on, they sat together on the snow-covered ground, wrapped in the quiet beauty of the moment. The stars overhead, the lake before them, and the warmth between them. It was all a gift, one that Amelia knew she would carry with her long after the snow had melted and the holiday season had passed. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. Ready to embrace what was to come, to cherish what she had, and to trust that everything in its own time would fall into place.